Want to get better at critical analysis, like really level up those skills for those tougher academic papers, or even just to see through some of the nonsense we get bombarded with every day.
It's a skill that can really make a difference in how you see the world.
Exactly. So today we're doing a deep dive into a resource I found really interesting. It's the Critical Analysis Toolkit from the University of Sheffield Management School.
Oh, that's a great one. I've used that myself. Lots of good stuff in there.
It's packed with practical tips, which I appreciate. Not just theory, but stuff you can actually use.
Yeah, it's very hands-on.
One thing that stood out to me right away is how they emphasize the shift from just describing things to actual critical thinking.
Right, like it's not enough to know the facts. You got to be able to do something with them.
Like knowing that 5 times 5 is 25 is one thing, but understanding why multiplication works that way, that's a whole other level.
Exactly, and that's what they're getting at here. They even have this cool visual, the semantic wave, to help you understand how an argument builds from just describing stuff to like serious analysis.
Oh yeah, I remember that. It's like starting in shallow water and then the wave gets bigger as you move into deeper, more analytical territory.
Exactly, and they give a good example of how this works with writing about a historical event. At first, you might just give the basic rundown: who, what, when, where, but to really get into that critical analysis, you got to start asking why and how.
Like what were the underlying causes, the long-term consequences, that kind of stuff.
Right. It's about going beyond that basic Peel structure we all learned in school. Point, evidence, explain, link. Peel's great for getting started, but it doesn't always get you thinking critically.
That's where their idea of repacking comes in, right?
Exactly. Unpack the information, analyze it, and then repackage it with your own insights.
And they suggest using Socratic questioning to help with that. Honestly, it always sounded kind of intimidating to me, like something Socrates would do in ancient Greece.
It might sound fancy, but it's actually pretty straightforward. It's just about asking the right questions to dig deeper.
Like playing detective with the information.
Exactly. To give a good example with a study about leadership styles and employee performance. A critical thinker wouldn't just accept the study's findings at face value. They'd start asking questions.
Like what kind of evidence did they use? Was the study even any good? Were there any biases?
Right, and what are the real world implications? Like, would this leadership style work everywhere or just in certain situations?
So it's about turning the information inside out, looking at it from all angles.
Exactly, and that's what makes critical thinking so powerful.
They also give some good general advice about critical analysis, like remember to avoid personal opinions, like, I think.
Yeah, keep the focus on the subject itself. Don't let your feelings get in the way.
And always make sure to provide context for your reader.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can't just throw out ideas without explaining where they're coming from. You need to ground your analysis in existing knowledge and theories. Like building a house, you need a solid foundation.
Makes sense.
Now, the toolkit defines critical thinking pretty clearly. It's about understanding how ideas connect logically, why they matter, and how to back up what you believe with solid reasons.
And they contrast that with uncritical thinking, which is basically just taking everything at face value without questioning it.
Right, going with the flow, which can be pretty dangerous sometimes.
Yeah.
They really hit home the importance of questionability and objectivity in critical thinking.
So questionability means not being gullible, right? Question everything, don't just take things at face value.
Exactly. And objectivity is all about trying to see things from a neutral perspective, setting aside your own biases. Not easy, but very important.
Like trying to see the world through someone else's eyes.
Right. And the toolkit lays out 2 techniques for critical thinking: intuitive and process-driven.
So intuitive is probably what most of us do already, right? Just thinking things through based on what we already know.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. They use this example of smoking is good for you to show how this works.
Even though we know that's not true, you can still use it as a starting point to think critically.
Right. You try to understand why someone might believe that. Maybe they think it helps them relax or something. And then you think about the counter-arguments. Health risks, the cost, the impact on others.
It's like having a debate with yourself, weighing the pros and cons.
Exactly. Now, the process-driven technique is a bit more structured. They introduced the critical thinking stairway from the Open University. It's like a step-by-step guide to deeper analysis.
Okay, love a good stairway metaphor. Take me up to the next level of critical thinking. What are the steps?
Well, the first step is just taking in the information, whatever it is.
Okay, that's easy enough.
Then you move to understanding, making sure you really get the main points, the arguments, the evidence.
Got it. What's next?
Then you analyze it, break it down, see how the different parts fit together, then you synthesize, bring it all together to get a bigger picture.
Like piecing together a puzzle.
Exactly. And once you have a clearer picture, then you evaluate, is this information any good? How relevant is it? How does it connect to other things?
So you're not just accepting it anymore, you're deciding how valuable it is.
Right. And finally, you reach the top of the stairway. Application. This is where you actually use what you've learned.
Okay, that's the part I like. Makes it feel worthwhile.
Absolutely. And speaking of making things worthwhile, they also talk about finding good quality sources for your analysis. Especially important for postgraduate work, they say.
Yeah, the higher the stakes, the better your sources need to be. But how do you even find those good sources? There's so much information out there.
Well, they suggest looking at the references in the articles you're already reading. That can lead you to other relevant, maybe even more critical works.
Like following a trail of breadcrumbs to a whole feast of information.
Exactly. And they also recommend checking out reading lists from your courses. Those are usually put together by experts, so they're a good starting point.
Good point. I often forget about those. But what if you need to go beyond what's on those lists and find stuff on your own?
Then they recommend this thing called the ABS list. It's a ranking of academic journals based on how good they are.
Like a Michelin star rating system, but for research papers?
Exactly. A 3-star journal is like a gourmet meal for your brain. And then they have this other framework called angles of critique to help you evaluate research and theories.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. What were those angles again?
Demographics, context, method, and practice.
Okay, so like if I'm reading a research study, I'd ask questions about who the participants were.
Right. Are they all from the same background, or was there diversity? Then they consider the context. Where and when was this study done? Would the findings be different if it was done somewhere else or at a different time?
Makes sense.
And then you look at the method. How did they collect their data? Was the study designed well? And finally, you think about practice. Do the findings of this study have any real-world applications?
It's like giving the research a full checkup.
Exactly. It helps you go beyond just accepting the study's conclusions and really understand the nuances. And that's what critical thinking is all about, asking the right questions and digging deeper. It really pushes you to think for yourself.
Absolutely. And speaking of thinking for yourself, one thing that really struck me was how the toolkit connects critical thinking to getting a job.
Yeah. Sometimes it feels like what we learn in school and what employers want are totally different things.
Right. But they make a strong case that critical thinking is like a golden ticket in the job market these days.
Absolutely. They even use Barclays, the big financial company, as an example.
Oh, interesting. What do they do?
Barclays has this program called Life Skills that's all about developing problem-solving skills, which go hand in hand with critical thinking.
That's awesome. Shows they're not just looking for robots who can follow instructions.
Exactly. They want people who can think on their feet and solve problems. And they actually have this 6-step problem-solving process on their website. It's pretty cool.
Okay, I'm all about actionable steps. Give me the rundown.
First, you got to identify the problem.
Seems obvious, but I bet people jump to solutions before they even know what the problem really is.
Happens all the time. Then you break the problem down into smaller, more manageable pieces.
Makes it less overwhelming.
Right. Then you got to look for patterns. Are there any recurring things that might be contributing to the problem?
Playing detective, looking for clues.
That's it. Then it's brainstorming time. Think freely about all the possible solutions. Don't hold back.
Love that. No idea is too crazy at this stage.
Exactly. Then you got to pick a solution and try it out. See what happens in the real world.
Put it to the test.
Right. And the final step is to evaluate. What worked? What didn't? What did you learn?
So important. It's all about learning and getting better for next time.
Exactly. They even have student worksheets and interview tips on their website.
Okay, definitely checking that out later. Now, we've talked a lot about critical thinking in general, but the toolkit also has some great advice for postgraduate students, like taking things to an even higher level.
Oh yeah, postgraduate work is a whole other ballgame. You got to be able to really engage with the material, synthesize information, find those gaps in research, and come up with your own original arguments.
Right, you can't just coast on summarizing anymore. Now, they talk a lot about argument building and mapping for postgrads. Can you remind me how that mapping thing works again?
Sure. It's a visual way to break down and analyze an argument. You start by writing your main conclusion at the top. Then you branch out and list your reasons, the things that support your conclusion. And then you can add another layer with evidence for each reason.
Like a family tree for your argument. Main idea at the top and all the supporting branches growing down from it.
Perfect analogy. It helps you see the structure of your argument and whether there are any weaknesses.
It's like giving your argument A health check.
Exactly. And they also talk about using specific phrases to show your reader that you're really thinking critically. Especially important at the postgraduate level.
Yeah, gotta impress those professors. What kind of phrases are we talking about?
Things like, consideration of these sources leads to the conclusion that, or, in conclusion, the analysis demonstrates that.
So basically you're signaling that you've done the work and these are your own insights.
Exactly. And they stress the importance of using top-notch sources for postgraduate work, like articles from those really good academic journals. It's about having a solid foundation for your arguments.
But how do you even know which journals are the best?
Remember the ABS list. That's your go-to guide. Aim for those 3-star and 4-star journals.
Right, like aiming for the Michelin-starred restaurants of research. And they also talk about using Google and Google Scholar effectively.
Right. Google Scholar is specifically for academic stuff, while regular Google is, well, for everything.
So when I'm hunting for scholarly articles and all that, I should stick with Google Scholar.
Definitely. Now, we talked earlier about incorporating your own voice into your writing while staying objective. That's a key skill at any level, but especially for postgrads.
Yeah, finding that balance is tricky. How do you walk that line?
They have some good advice there. One thing they suggest is starting your paragraphs with statements that don't need a citation, and then you back them up with evidence from your sources.
Can you give me an example of how that might look?
Sure. Imagine you're writing about the history of a social movement. You could start a paragraph with something like, this movement was ultimately successful in achieving its goals, but at a significant cost.
Okay, bold statement, but it sounds like something that needs some proof.
Exactly. So then you back it up with historical evidence.
Yeah.
Specific events, statistics, maybe even quotes from primary sources. That way you're not just stating an opinion, you're supporting it.
Got it. What else do they recommend?
Being explicit about how you're connecting different sources. You can use phrases like, Smith, however, takes a different approach. Or, building on the work of Jones, this study examines, that kind of thing.
So you're showing how the ideas relate to each other.
Exactly. And finally, be upfront about your stance on the sources you're using. Are you agreeing with them, disagreeing, or somewhere in between?
Right. Be clear about where you stand.
Exactly. And all these tips apply to any kind of writing, really, not just academic stuff. They can help you be a clearer and more persuasive communicator.
Yeah, that's a valuable skill no matter what you're doing. Now, remember how we talked about reflexivity earlier? It's a really important concept for postgraduate students, especially when it comes to research.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we, as researchers, aren't just neutral observers. We bring our own biases and experiences to the table.
Right. Like we were saying before, everyone has their own perspective.
Exactly. And in research, it's about being aware of how that subjectivity might be affecting your work.
So like if you're researching something you have strong feelings about, you need to be extra careful not to let those feelings cloud your judgment.
Exactly. The toolkit gives this example of a researcher interviewing women in leadership roles. Let's say the researcher is a young woman just starting her own career. She might be more likely to connect with the struggles of the women she's talking to.
Makes sense. Shared experiences and all that.
Right. Or if she's had bad experiences with sexism in the workplace, that could affect how she interprets the data she's collecting.
So even though we aim for objectivity, there's always that subjective element that we need to be aware of.
Exactly. Reflexivity is about acknowledging that subjectivity and doing what you can to minimize its impact. It's about being honest with yourself, about your assumptions, and how your own experiences might be shaping your research.
That's deep. It's almost like therapy for researchers.
In a way, it is. The toolkit suggests some practical things you can do to be more reflexive, like keep a journal where you reflect on your thoughts and feelings throughout the research process, or talk to colleagues or mentors who can give you different perspectives.
Those are good ideas, like having a support system for your research.
Exactly. And it all comes back to being as rigorous and unbiased as you can be. Now, speaking of rigor, let's talk about source searching. That's another crucial skill for researchers.
Always looking for tips on that front. The internet can be a jungle.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
The toolkit really emphasizes the importance of high-quality sources, especially from those top-tier journals.
We've talked about those.
Right. And they give some good pointers on using Google and Google Scholar. Remember how we were talking about the difference?
Yeah, Google Scholar is like the research-focused version of Google.
Exactly. It's where you want to be when you're looking for scholarly articles, books, and all that good stuff.
Got it. And of course, the ABS list is always there to help us assess the quality of the journals we're looking at.
Always a good resource. Now let's revisit that idea of incorporating your own voice while staying objective. It's a challenge, but an important one to master.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope. You want to show your own thinking, but you don't want to go too far and sound like you're just giving your opinion.
Right. And the toolkit has some good strategies for finding that balance. One is to start your paragraphs with statements that don't need a citation, and then you back them up with evidence.
We talked about that before, right? Give me another example. I'm starting to get it, but more examples always help.
Sure. Let's say you're writing about the impacts of climate change on a specific region. You could start a paragraph with something like, this region is already seeing serious negative effects from climate change, and things are only going to get worse.
Okay, strong statement. Need some backing up.
Exactly. So you'd follow that up with data on things like rising sea levels, changing weather patterns, the economic and social impacts. That way, you're making a bold claim, but you're grounding it in solid research.
Got it. Evidence is key.
Always. And they also talk about being clear about how you're connecting different sources, using phrases like, however, Smith takes a different approach, or building on Jones's work, this study, that kind of thing.
Shows how the ideas relate to each other. Like, you're having a conversation with the research.
Exactly. And finally, be upfront about your stance on the sources you're using. Are you on board with what they're saying? Do you disagree? Or do you have a more nuanced perspective?
Right, show your thinking.
Exactly. All these strategies help you incorporate sources effectively and make your voice heard in the academic world.
It's like you're not just reporting on the research, you're actively adding to the conversation.
It's about becoming a true critical thinker, not just someone who can parrot back information.
I love that. It's about engaging with the research, having a conversation with it, not just absorbing it passively.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to touch on something we talked about earlier, the critical thinking stairway.
Oh yeah, the stairway to critical thinking nirvana. What were the steps again? It's been a while.
Okay, so first, you just take in the information, whatever it is you're looking at. Then you move to understanding, where you're really trying to grasp those main ideas and the underlying assumptions. Next comes analysis, where you break things down and see how they all fit together. Then you synthesize, bringing everything together to get that big picture view. And from there, you move on to evaluation. Is this information any good? How relevant is it? And finally, you reach application, which is where you use what you've learned to solve problems or answer questions.
Wow, it really is a journey, isn't it? You're not just sitting there taking notes. You're actively wrestling with the information at every stage.
That's what makes it so powerful. And the best part is it's not a one-time climb. You can use these steps again and again for any topic you come across.
It's like a workout routine for your brain. The more you use it, the stronger your critical thinking muscles get.
Exactly. And speaking of those muscles, let's not forget about the other tools we've talked about today. Socratic questioning, the semantic wave, the angles of critique. These are all techniques that you can use to flex those critical thinking muscles and approach information with more confidence and insight.
It's like we've assembled this awesome toolkit for our minds. So let's recap the key takeaways from our deep dive today. First, we learned that moving from descriptive to critical thinking is absolutely essential for success in higher education and in our careers. It's about moving beyond summarizing to analyzing, evaluating, and forming our own well-supported conclusions.
And we explored how to use Socratic questioning, asking those probing questions that really challenge assumptions and help us uncover those hidden meanings.
Right, those questions like, what's the evidence? Are there other viewpoints? And what are the real-world implications of this?
We also talked about finding quality sources for our research, using tools like the ABS list to assess the credibility of journals, and following those reference trails to discover new and relevant information.
And we learned some great strategies for building strong arguments, like using argument mapping to create that clear, logical structure.
We also talked about how to bring our own voice into our writing while staying academically rigorous. It's about finding that balance between expressing our own perspective and staying grounded in the research.
And for those of you who are ready to level up even further, we touched on the concept of reflexivity, recognizing that we all have biases, and those biases can shape how we see the world.
And remember, critical thinking is an ongoing process. It's not about reaching some endpoint. It's about developing a mindset of curiosity, asking questions, and being willing to challenge your own assumptions.
It's about becoming a lifelong learner and a more engaged, more informed person.
So as you go about your day, keep those critical thinking tools handy. Ask tough questions, challenge the status quo, and don't be afraid to dig deeper.
What will you critically analyze today?